Chapter 12 we cover intangible assets, which are assets that lack physical existence. In this segment we look at the possible impairment of intangible assets, and we review 3 different categories because each of these has a slightly different way of assessing whether or not the asset is in fact impaired. In the first segment we look at assets that have a limited life. We're going to look at a copyright that had an original cost of $8.6 million. It's now in our books for $4.3 million. It has expected cash flows in the future of $4 million, and it's got a current fair value of $3.2 million. There are 2 steps in this process whenever you have a limited life asset, an asset that has a distinct useful life. We're going to look at the expected future cash flows. In this case it's $4 million, and we're going to compare that to the carrying amount, which is $4.3 million. We have a loss of $300,000 based on that calculation, and that indicates that this test failed. This was a screening test. If we failed this test, we move on to step 2, and that's where we calculate the actual journal entry. So $300,000 is not actually booked. It's just helping us decide that, yeah, we've got a problem. We're going to move on to step 2. In step 2, we actually compare the fair value to the carrying amount. And in this case, we've got a $1.1 million difference that we record as a loss. We debit loss on impairment and we credit the copyright. It's worth noting that the future cash flows is not a discounted amount. That is a gross amount just of simply adding up all the future cash flows. We compare that to the carrying amount to determine whether or not we fail or pass the recoverability test. In the next step, we actually calculate the loss. And because we failed the first test, we moved on to the second step and we compared the fair value, which is a discounted amount, to the carrying amount. In the next category, we look at assets that have an indefinite life, excluding goodwill. We are unable to do the recoverability test because we can't look at future cash flows and estimate those or quantify those because we don't know how long that asset is going to be in play. It has an indefinite life. So we really just have to skip the recoverability test because we can't really quantify expected future cash flows. We move right to the fair value test. We compare the fair value, in this case is $1.5 million, to the $2 million, and we come up with a loss of $500,000. The $500,000 is booked to a loss on impairment, and we credit the license directly. So if you have an indefinite life asset, intangible asset, and you're not looking at goodwill, you simply move right to the fair value test and you book any loss that you do quantify. In this last section, we'll analyze goodwill for impairment. First, we'll perform a qualitative test, which is a fairly new test, and that's where we determine whether or not it is more likely than not that the fair value is less than the carrying amount. We'll look at things such as the economic condition that the entity operates in, we'll look at its financial performance, and we'll look at things that would be unique, such as whether or not we think that unit will be sold in the future. If it fails this test, we move on to the fair value test. I'm going to look at the fair value of that division, and I've got 2 pieces of information. I've got future cash flows, but I have a third-party offer of $335. I'm going to go with the $335 as a better measurement because it's a third-party estimate of the value of that division. I'm going to subtract the net assets of that division, which are $360. It's simply the assets added up less the liabilities, so the net assets are $360. I take the fair value minus those net assets, and I've got a problem because the fair value is less than that value. I need to move on to step 3 to calculate the loss on impairment. I'm going to take the fair value of that division, which I've already determined to be $335, and I'm going to subtract out the carrying amount of that division outside or net of goodwill. So I've calculated that here. I've got $360 as net assets. I subtracted out goodwill, and I've got assets net of goodwill of $160. So what's on my books? I've got $160 excluding goodwill. So if I think that this asset is worth, this division is worth 335, on my books I've got 160 ignoring goodwill. That would mean that I have implied goodwill of 175, because that would be the difference between everything else and the fair value. So basically my books are implying that I have 175 of goodwill. The problem is that my goodwill on my books is actually 200. So I've got a issue of 25. The 25 is going to be booked as a loss on impairment and a credit to goodwill. So I would debit loss on impairment for 25 and I would credit goodwill for 25.